So my name is Esther Bleicher. I'm a lawyer by training and now by practice. I've been in and out of the practice of law, and I also have an MPH. Currently, I am Chief Counsel of Therapeutics and Project Technology at a company called Valo Health that works on AI in drug development. So I work a lot with traditional scientists and also computational scientists, traditional for drug development, I should say, and also data scientists and software engineers. And it's really fun to see that come together. Before that, I was head of legal and regulatory at another startup in the Boston area, but I spent most of my career at the FDA in a variety of roles. I was deputy chief of staff during the Obama administration for the FDA commissioner, and I was also senior policy advisor at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, where I got to work on a whole bunch of really fun policies related to medical devices, including FDA's digital health policies. And then, as Chuck mentioned, I'm involved with AAIH. I'm the co-chair of the Federal Engagement and Regulatory Affairs Committee there. And then I advise companies on digital ethics, which is super fun. So throughout this presentation, and this is what we're going to do today. Please feel free to interrupt. It's really weird to be presenting on Zoom and just talking at my computer. So I welcome the interruption with questions if you have them. So I'll start by just giving the basics of FDA, talk about the FDA touch points with AI, and then really focus on the regulatory challenges for AI in medical devices. And of course, time for questions. And again, please feel free to interrupt with questions if you have them as I go. So the Federal Food and Drug Administration has a very broad remit. FDA regulates about 20 cents of every dollar spent in the US annually. And the products are also span a range. So medical devices, drugs, biologics, there's like the medical products wing of the agency. FDA also regulates food, animal products, which include both drugs and food for animals, and tobacco. When thinking about how just FDA does what it does and thinks about problems, the first thing to understand is what FDA cares about. So this is from FDA's mission statement, where you can see that FDA has put it upon itself to, and Congress has dictated that FDA should be responsible for protecting the public health, ensuring the safety, effectiveness, and security of all of the products it regulates, including medical devices. And it also has this responsibility to advance public health by encouraging innovation and also making sure that the public understands what it's getting through accurate science-based information. When FDA gets something new, like AI, machine learning, what does it do? Well, this is not the first rodeo for FDA in terms of new technological advances. FDA has absorbed many throughout its over 100-year lifespan as an administrative agency. So there are a few go-tos for the agency. First, FDA looks to treat likes alike. So it tries to see what it's regulated in the past or what it's currently regulating that might have similarities to what the new thing is, and to try to really draw those connections clearly and distinctly to make sure that the agency is treating products that should be treated the same in the same way, even if they don't look the same on the outset. FDA has a really robust set of existing authority that are flexible and that are meant to apply broadly. So this first bullet, reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, that's the standard for getting a medical device on the market. FDA wants to make sure that there's a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. That applies to tongue depressors, it applies to artificial limbs, it applies to pacemakers, it applies to algorithms, it applies across the board. And you can see how it could, because it is that basic and really gets at the heart of what FDA is trying to accomplish. And as another example, with labeling, it's got to be truth and not misleading. And those two are different. And I'm happy to dive into that if you want to, but it could also be a separate conversation. And again, that's like pretty general and pretty basic. And it also applies to software as well as a more traditional, I'll say, medical product. FDA is used to balancing risks and benefits, and risk can come from uncertainty as well. So FDA every day makes decisions in the face of uncertainty. So having something that's new doesn't make FDA run for the hills. It's just another source of uncertainty that FDA has to figure out how to deal with and to address in its decision making. And then the last is seeking public input. FDA knows that there are things that it understands better than anybody else. It understands its regulations. It understands its regulatory regime. It understands what has come to the agency already more than anybody else, but it does not understand what's coming down the pike. And it needs input from clinicians and industry and patient groups and scientists and students and faculty to be able to make the right policy choices for the future. So there are a smattering of ways that AI and FDA intersect. FDA oversees software that is itself a medical device. And then it also oversees software that is in medical devices, and there's lots of that going on. AI is used to create models that are used to develop medical products, and software can also accompany a medical product. Like, let's say you have an app that helps you know when to take your drug. All of those FDA regulates in some way or another. And then internally, FDA has for a while actually used an algorithm that's AI based to determine when to stop food at the border because there's way too much. And so it uses a risk-based approach that is enabled by this algorithm to help keep the country safe. So I'm going to focus today on the AI-enabled or AI-based software that is a medical device that FDA regulates. So just going to basics, how can AI-based software be a medical device? Like, that doesn't seem like to make sense intuitively to some. So the definition of medical device is quite broad, and the agency has interpreted really non-controversially to the definition of medical device to include software. So software that's intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of a disease is a medical device. And the blue box is that medical device definition. And medical devices are regulated by a certain center within the FDA, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Some examples of software that are medical devices: software that allows a smartphone to view images obtained from an MRI for diagnostic purposes. There are also a whole set of computer-aided detection software, or CAD software, that performs post-image processing to help detect a variety of different diseases, breast cancer being one of them. There's most software that is on the market today that's in this bucket is used for diagnosis, or it's used to assist clinicians in diagnosis. There's some, though, that are used for treatment, and those are mostly in the mental health space. So there's software that provides cognitive behavioral therapy to help treat substance use disorder. And you might be wearing an Apple Watch. I am actually wearing an Apple Watch, and it is a medical device. In fact, it's been cleared by FDA to create, analyze, and display an ECG. And even though you're not supposed to do anything with that result without going to a doctor first, it's still considered a medical device regulated by FDA. So I give you a handful of examples, but this font is too small, at least for me to read on my screen. I don't know about you. And the list goes on and on. This is actually an old slide. So FDA has quite a bit of experience with reviewing applications for artificial intelligence-based algorithms. How does FDA regulate software? Okay. It's risk-based, which is like FDA's oversight of medical devices generally. So right now, FDA is using the current regime that it has for every other medical device and layering software on top of it. So what you have here in this table, this is how FDA regulates medical devices generally. And it, again, applies to the medical devices that are software and that are software generated through the use of AI. There's the lowest risk, which is class 1. Those are usually exempt from pre-market review, which means that they do not need to come to the agency before being sold on the shelves. But they do have to comply with the very basic general controls that every medical device has to follow. And that is like the stuff that you assume every company is doing already. Like that's the quality system that they have to have. It's in like in manufacturing, it's labeling, which are not very robust in the device space. Nevertheless, there are labeling requirements. There are requirements for adverse event reporting. And again, for the lowest risk stuff, that's going to be a very moderate requirement. But so there are these basic requirements that apply across the board. But for those lowest risk products like Band-Aids are the low risk product, there's no pre-market review. This moderate risk category, which is class 2, usually there is pre-market review required. It's called a 510K, sometimes it's called de novo. That's extra credit. You do not have to remember that. And that is the category where most algorithms that have come to the agency have fallen today. They're considered moderate risk because in general, they are used to assist in the diagnosis of disease, or they're used to supplement or complement the treatment of disease. They're not used to do the diagnosing or to do the treating themselves for high risk diseases. And so they fit into this moderate risk category, which has some pre-market review, but it's relatively light, I would say, in comparison to the third category, the highest risk, which is that the greatest evidentiary burden pre-market. And having gone through and reviewed many, many submissions now with software, FDA has started to publish guidance documents related to software and pre-market submissions. And this is one that came out on November 4th, 2021. So this came out last week. This is a draft guidance on the content of pre-market submissions for device software functions. And the thing about it is that it goes into like loads of detail about design and various development pieces, probably things that you all would understand better than me. But it only mentions machine learning once. And it says, when you're thinking about the content for your pre-market submission, you should ask yourself this question. If the device is AI ML enabled, what populations or samples have informed the model? And what steps were taken to identify and address potential biases and limitations of the model? So it will be very interesting to see if that stands in the final guidance or if the ML section becomes more robust. And my prediction, since this is being recorded, we can see if I'm right, is that it will be. That FDA, through this question, is really saying like, this is the bare bones, but they're asking for public comment, and they want people to look at this and other pieces of the guidance document to see whether they've got it right or whether they need to add. Okay, regulatory challenges for AI. The FDA has really been working hard to engage the community to think about these issues. there's a sense that AI is different, but exactly how to manage those differences are still open questions. So even in January of this year, FDA put out this action plan to articulate a handful of activities that they expect to do in the near future to try to figure it out. But one of the themes in that is transparency. FDA thinks about transparency to mean users should understand, AI-based software well enough to know whether and how to use it. It seems simple enough, and it should apply to devices across the board. So it's not anything new there. But then what does that mean when you're talking about AI? Because the way that AI, and I'm really thinking about machine learning when I'm saying AI, because of the way that machine learning based software is generated, it's different than the way that other devices are, and can the ways that FDA requires transparency for other devices apply. And so here, the elements that FDA is calling out for AI-based software are, I think, probably users should know the data that were used to develop the algorithm to train or to test it, to train and to test it. Users should be informed of the relevance of the inputs, which means that the developer needs to know the relevance of the inputs, the logic the algorithm employs, if possible. And so that gives a little window to black box algorithms, but demonstrates FDA's preference for explainable AI. The intended use of the output, that's a basic. What is this thing even trying to do in the world? What's the evidence of the device's performance? FDA thinks users should have a sense of that. And again, there's this preference for explainable AI so that the transparency can be provided in a more fleshed out way.
Hey, Esther, a quick question.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting onus on the user, and maybe a slightly different onus than the user of other FDA-regulated devices. And the first one jumps out at me. Does that, expectation that the user understands the data that were used to train and test the algorithm, does that in turn suggest that the manufacturers should be delivering with the product a description of the algorithm and the data that were used to train and test the algorithm? Would that be an expectation? Again, quite different from what might be an expectation of the manufacturer, but should we be expecting to see that kind of thing delivered with the product?
Yes, I think that that's where FDA is going. But again, it's all it's at this level. There's still not a lot of specificity about what the requirements really would be. So I'll actually flip to this page. This is teeny, but you can see this is an example of what someone has put together about what like a nutrition facts, software facts labeling could look like. But this wouldn't be the full labeling. This would just be the summary. And then there would be more information in the back. If you think about drug labeling as an example, there's a description of the clinical study, and that would be true for a class 3 medical device too. There would be a description of the clinical study, and there would be the demographics of the patients who were in the clinical study. And so FDA is trying to say, well, what's the analogy here? Although at the same time, most algorithms that make it through FDA have undergone prospective clinical study review. So most of them, are generated through retrospective analysis, analyzing data that currently exists. But then in order to make it onto the market through FDA, they have to show FDA that if they try it out in the real world prospectively, that it works. And so maybe that data should be enough. Maybe the data of that final clinical study should be sufficient. I think it's a really interesting question and one that FDA should consider.
Thank you so much. The analogies to what information is provided with drugs is really helpful. Thank you, Esther.
Sure. I think too, as people try to do this, there's also a question of what do physicians understand? It's no good giving users information if they're not going to understand it. So what are users going to understand about the inputs of software or the technique that was used, the specific machine learning technique that was used? And is that really relevant for their use of the product? So all of those are open questions. And to the theme of open questions, FDA has really tried to seek public input on this specifically. So last October, 2020, there was a patient advisory committee meeting on artificial intelligence and machine learning in medical devices, trying to understand what patients would expect. And there was a lot in there about transparency. And then there was a transparency workshop a few weeks ago that if you have the free time, I mean, you can like watch it on YouTube, I think, or maybe there's some other plugin, but you can watch it online. There's a recording and it's really interesting if you're into this stuff. So I highly recommend it. And then I highly recommend you submit a comment if you think FDA is barking up the wrong tree or whatever. Another way that machine learning might be considered different from other medical devices is continual learning. So the idea, and here there's static ML and adaptive ML, but you could even think of just a regular traditional medical device that you've designed it and you've tested it, and now you're like stamping it out. You can still have a new design. And so you still have an iterative process where you can say, oh, actually users don't like this feature. And so I'm going to iterate on that and I'm going to change the design. And then I'm going to stamp out design number 2. That is a slow process and FDA's current regime can totally handle that. If you've made a change that's significant enough because you're having to change your manufacturing process anyway, you have time to go to FDA. For regular software, that's not generated through the use of machine learning, that doesn't use continual learning, it's much easier to push out those updates. But then there's like the extreme version of continual learning where if instead, where you really don't have time, there's just no, if you want to have the feedback loop to be continuous, then how do you inform FDA and get FDA's blessing before going out with a new version? That's the problem that FDA is trying to solve. And so what they've done is they said, okay, well, maybe we could lock in the what and the how ahead of time. So you could have what they're calling an SPS, the SAMD pre-specifications, which are the what that the algorithm intends the algorithm, sorry, what the manufacturer intends the algorithm to become as it learns. FDA is calling this the region of potential changes around the initial specifications and labeling. So if you are expecting there to be iterations on a certain feature, then maybe you could say, okay, this is the zone around that feature where I expect this algorithm to be changing. And then FDA doesn't just want to know that, thankfully, I think that'd be a little scary, but also wants to know the how. So how will the algorithm learn and how will the algorithm change and what controls will be in place to make sure that those changes are being made in a way that doesn't adversely affect the safety and effectiveness of the algorithm.
Esther,
so that's, yeah.
At the moment, it's my understanding that the FDA, to make sure that algorithms are safe, especially ones that require some burden of proof, you know, in the moderate to high risk category, effectively have to be quote unquote sort of locked, right? It's got to be the final version of whatever you're doing. And so if it's a truly live algorithm, it actually would directly just invalidate that logic. So how are they handling that even under this continual learning framework, because this looks very non-specific like the rest of the guidance so far, and doesn't address the idea that the algorithm is sort of quote unquote locked at any given time that it's applied to a given patient.
Yes, so you're right that for the most part, the algorithms today need to be locked, and then you go to FDA and you show FDA your locked version, and that's how that happens. And I work with many software engineers who think that that is correct, and that today it would be irresponsible to try to do this continual learning thing without having a better understanding. Nevertheless, FDA is trying to make policy for the future. So I'll show you this diagram. Maybe this is helpful and maybe it doesn't answer your question, but we will see. So here, the idea is you've got your, can you see my cursor?
Yep.
Okay. So the software, the CMDs means software is a medical device. So the software is approved with this SPS and this ACP. Okay, then there's a modification that happens. And if that modification is within the agreed upon SPS or ACP, you're done. That's just, and there should be documentation that shoots out, but there's no need for a person to be involved in that. If it's outside, then FDA does need to review it. And it would either the whole thing would be reviewed because the intended use changed, or just an SPS and ACP would need to be reviewed. But that's a current literal cartoon version that is under, it's open for comment, and we should expect a new version to come out that will also be a draft for public comment. We're not even in the stage where FDA thinks it's getting ready to finalize something yet. But what FDA has done is authorized a software, so this is the first cardiac ultrasound software using AI to guide the user, so it's really cool. And it was also the first time that one of these change protocols was included in the authorization. So FDA is allowing the manufacturer of this product to change it up without going back to them. And I don't know the specifics of that protocol to know whether it's really continual or whether it's still locking, and then there's some kind of review process, and then there's another locking, but that review process would happen within the manufacturer, not going back to the agency.
That's very helpful, thanks.
Sure. All right, good machine learning practices. So this is another chunk for FDA to think through. Well, first go is to apply the existing regulations. So this is the table of contents for Part 820 of Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It's got a lot of stuff in there that should be relatively straightforward. It's intended to address the methods, facilities, controls for design, manufacture, packaging, labeling, storage, installation, and servicing of finished medical devices. And the whole goal is to ensure that the finished devices that come out meet all the specs that FDA authorized in the first place, that these devices are reliably safe and effective and of high quality. If you did one tick down, which I will not subject you to, these are still very high level requirements. So they are intended to be general, flexible, to apply to the broad range of medical devices that exist in the world, even absent AI. And there's a lot of do this if applicable, do that if applicable. So FDA is continually trying to address the universe of devices. But nevertheless, FDA and Canada and the UK have come together and put out, again, like in the last week or two, these good machine learning practice guiding principles. And these you can see are more tailored to machine learning. And it's not clear if these would replace those other ones or whether there would be something else that comes out of this. So this would be supplemental. And there's also like some interweavings here of maybe pre-market review requirements instead of manufacturing requirements. So it's all a little bit muddled, but nevertheless, this shows you directionally where those health authorities are thinking, where their minds are when it comes to what makes a high quality, safe, effective piece of software. So the first is that multidisciplinary expertise is leveraged through the total product life cycle. That there's need for clinicians and patients, in addition to software engineers being involved. That there's good software engineering and security practices. Clinical study participants and data sets are representative of the intended patient population. And it is very interesting too there, the addition of data sets, right? Why isn't the clinical study sufficient as it is for other medical products? That training data sets are independent of test sets. That is actually like good machine learning hygiene. And it goes on. In the interest of time, I'll go forward. I'm pretty close to being done actually, but.
Esther, there's a question here.
Yes.
Is there a concern about the need to check and revalidate models after they are approved and potentially applied to a broader patient population? And Andrew, yeah, you can.
Yeah, I think number 10 answers that question. I just didn't see that. It looks like that is a consideration.
Yeah, I think that FDA would like that FDA is it encourages that, at least the Center for Devices encourages that you could really demonstrate safety and effectiveness in a narrow population, but then you would have real world evidence that would support a broader intended use. And that would be cool. So this I'm putting up, I could walk you through it, but the point is there are a lot of arrows and numbers and boxes, and they're different colors. And it actually does make logical sense when you really walk through it. And it still needs a lot of work. So I put this here to show you that this is FDA's current mental model that is being updated in response to public comment and will be put out again. But it just evidences how FDA is just working it through. And it's a little messy and it's not perfect, and they're continuing to work it through and to use actually unusual methods of getting information out there. FDA doesn't really write white papers or action plans. They write
Well, Esther, you've frozen.
Yeah, looks like her Wi-Fi was yellow and it just cut out. We'll give her a moment to get back. Chuck, could you maybe text her or just let her know that she dropped out?
I'll send her. Yeah.
Thanks, Chuck. Any comments on the diagram? Sometimes, for example, when, oh, go ahead, anybody? There she goes. I was going to say, hopefully you have that diagram in your mental memory. The model, a continuously training model, you would ask, oh, hey, Esther, welcome back.
back.
Yeah,
Yay.
welcome back.
You're back.
Start up your slides. I was just going to say, you know, a simple model might be simply to retrain the continuously learning model on exactly the same data set that it were originally tested and was reviewed in the original submission, and basically to assure that the performance hasn't degraded on that same test set where it was originally assessed. That seems like the simplest, most conservative way to at least just assess a continuously learning system.
Yeah, that's a good point. You should put that in a public comment.
Thank you, Esther. Welcome back. We can see your stuff.
Good. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is bias. I think this is the boogeyman. This is the thing that FDA fears the most because it really is more different from what it's used to than the others. Although I would say that there's still, that it shouldn't seem so far off from what FDA has dealt with in the past and frankly not dealt with super successfully. So when I talk about bias, I talk about fairness. So fairness is like the opposite of bias. So in machine learning, an algorithm is fair if its results are independent of given variables that are sensitive, normally that are sensitive traits of individuals that should not correlate with the outcome: gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. There could be others as well. And you can have an algorithm that's biased and not in one of these ways. But this is the fear, that you would have medical products that are out there on the market that work for white dudes and don't work for anybody else, or work better for certain racial groups than others. And we've seen this in other contexts with the police use of algorithms. You can see this picture here where AI has taken a fuzzy picture of what we would all agree is Barack Obama. I'm going to turn him into somebody who's definitely not Barack Obama. And there was a horrific example of an algorithm that was used in Optum hospitals, I think, used in US hospitals to allocate healthcare to patients. And they used metrics that they thought might be relevant, and then some that they thought would be useful shorthands or sort of useful proxies. But it turned out that the algorithm was less likely to refer Black people than white people who were equally sick to programs to improve their care. And this really made people jump up, and this, among others, frankly, this is only one example, and say, like, we cannot have this be a real problem. Let's see, I don't remember. Yeah, so to me, I think you could think about the problem that has really plagued clinical trial management for decades, but the lack of diversity in clinical studies, and say this is an extension of that problem. And that problem has not been resolved well. Nevertheless, bias is a big issue that FDA is thinking about, and a reason why FDA prefers, as you can look at the bottom here, to have explainable AI as opposed to non-explainable AI, so that then maybe you can double check and make sure that there's not that bias that you might that might otherwise be lurking. So we know that the data matters, that data limitations result in algorithms that have limited applicability, that are maybe more brittle than they should be. But we do know that high quality data is hard to come by and is never fully represented. So just saying, well, we have to have perfect data, that's not a solution. So we need something else. There are some techniques that can be used to help out on the margins. And I think that research is really exciting, and it will be interesting to see what happens there. But everyone is really still grappling with this. And right now, FDA, again, as an agency that is used to uncertainty, that is used to making risk-benefit decisions, it's not going to say no algorithms forever because of this problem. But in thinking about how do you mitigate this risk, how do you decrease uncertainty? You could increase transparency. You could have good machine learning practices that say something about the way that you use the data. And then you could have a human in the loop. So most algorithms that have been gotten themselves through FDA today have a human in the loop, meaning that they are to inform a clinician, but they aren't doing the medical, doing the diagnosing themselves. And that also helps mitigate some risks that might come out of bias. But it's a really difficult one that we all need to think about more. Questions?
Well, thank you. That was certainly a great review of this. So if anyone has a question, please unmute and put your camera on and ask the question. With the uncertainty in the FDA on this, are pre-sub meetings as valuable and as recommended for anyone who's developing software?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Yeah. The more early interactions with FDA that you can have, the better. And they say that, but then they don't really want to talk to you super early because they want to talk to you once you have something. But when you have a pre-sub, that's when you have, you basically know what you're trying to make, and you have some key questions for the agency. And there's also, I think there's still an email like box, like you can send an email to, I don't know, digitalhealth@fda.gov or something. That might not be exactly it, but it's on the website, and a real person answers those emails. So even in the absence of a pre-sub, if you just have a question, FDA will answer you, because they realize that this is a space where there are sophisticated players, and I mean sophisticated in the sense of like people who've been around the block with FDA, but there are also a lot of people who are software developers who want to help patients, and they have no idea how to interact with FDA. So FDA is trying to make it more accessible.
I use you and I know what a pre-sub is, but there may be some people on this. So can you just briefly describe a pre-sub?
Yeah, so pre-sub stands for pre-submission. And it's before you submit a whole bunch of evidence to FDA. You submit something much smaller, explaining what your product is and explaining what you think is the appropriate amount of evidence that should gain approval. And if you have any questions about, is this sample size big enough? Is this data set representative enough? Is this intended use appropriate? You wouldn't ask the question in that specific way, but that's the idea, that you could ask these questions before you've completed all of the work. So like you have your plan for how you're going to do it, and you present that to FDA through a pre-sub, and then FDA will respond and will say yes, yes, no, no, and you can even have an in-person meeting with the agency, and they will help you understand whether what you're planning to submit is going to be acceptable if it all goes your way.
Great, thanks.
Esther,
Emma?
it was so, Emma, did you have a
Emma,
question?
yeah.
Hey, yeah, I've got a question. Esther, thank you so much for your talk. I have a question, maybe a little bit peripheral to this. So it looks like you're at a therapeutics company now. And I'm curious about the potential regulation or lack of regulation when it comes to drug discovery, and if it just doesn't matter how you got to your drug candidate and then the clinical trial results, or if in your IND submission you need to explain how you arrived at your candidate. I'm just curious about that area of AI.
Sure. So yeah, FDA does not care about drug discovery. They don't care. As my understanding of the landscape is that there are more companies that are doing AI and discovery for that reason. And maybe it's scientifically easier too. There's a lot of data about molecules that can be used, where if you're in the development stage, the data about people is more expensive and messier. So, so yeah, FDA doesn't care. But I have this intuition that there are things that these discoverers are learning about molecules earlier that could be relevant in FDA interactions. Like if they're really de-risking drug discovery and development, if they're really picking molecules that have a better likelihood of success, what are they really learning? Why do those molecules have a better likelihood of success? Do those molecules have a better fit to the target? Does that mean that they have fewer off-target effects? You can model that very early on, perhaps, and then that could translate into a likelihood of fewer adverse events. And so that could be interesting for FDA to know about. So what I am starting to do at Valo is, with my colleagues, to think about what have we figured out in discovery that we're just going to share with FDA, even though it's not required. We're going to share it with them and see what they do with it, and see if they think it's interesting or if they're like, ugh, whatever, and just start the dialogue and see how that goes.
Cool, very cool.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, go ahead.
Awesome. Hi, thanks so much. Thanks for the great presentation, Esther. My name is Connor, and I work with Hopkins Technology Ventures. So I used to work in the AI space in ophthalmology for a while, and so there have been some successes, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
There's Caption. A couple of years before that, IDXDR was another company that got approval for a diabetic retinopathy algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just curious if you have been involved in any of those submissions or just knew any details about them or ones that failed. What are there any patterns that you can identify for us in terms of the submissions that were successful or vice versa, the ones that were not?
So the only thing I can say, and this is not going to be so satisfying, is that they had many interactions with FDA. That's my understanding, that they really started talking with FDA to just really make sure that the expectations were aligned about the evidence generation. And yeah, I think that there are a lot of eye images out there, and that makes it very helpful. So having a lot of data is really useful, and data that you can trust and you can believe in is really useful. But I can't speak to the ones that didn't succeed.
Thank you.
Other questions? Well, you must have answered all the questions or left. Oh, there's one. There's a question in the chat. A graduate student shy. If a company provides a good description of intended use that appropriately addresses generalizability, but in typical use, users ignore advice about generalizability, does the FDA require reports of that in post-market?
Okay, so this is a really great, interesting question. Yes, you are required to report adverse events, no matter where they came. If people are totally disregarding the intended use, you have to report an adverse event. But you don't have to report off-label use if it doesn't create an adverse event. And then you get into this sticky situation where off-label use, meaning use that is not consistent with the intended use that FDA cleared or approved on the label, but maybe it's broader than what was cleared or approved on the label, say, that you're not allowed to market a drug for off-label use. So then FDA might say, okay, well, if so many people are using this, or a drug or a medical product, I should say software. I'm used to talking about drugs in my day job. But so if FDA will say, well, how come so many people are using this software for something else? Is it because the company is marketing it for this off-label use? So they'll dig in a little bit. And I think in this world of social media, it's totally possible that the company is not. It's also totally possible the company is. And FDA has inspectors who go around and try to figure that out. But right now, software is not FDA's biggest enforcement priority, for better or worse.
One of the things that I found out dealing with medical devices is just because you have FDA approval doesn't mean the market is going to accept it. Do you think the market out there is waiting and FDA approval will sort of open the door for people to use it, or will they still be reluctant after?
It's really interesting. I find the whole world of payers and, you know, and insurers and like healthcare providers, that to be very complicated, and incentives are not always transparent. So I don't know if people, like some people are certainly ready, consumers are ready. I don't know that physicians are so excited, but then there are lots of physicians that use these CAD applications because they're being told to do so. So I think there will be leaders and then there will be followers, like any other kind of innovation. And it'll just be really interesting to see what the market accepts.
Well, there's certainly a lot of applications out there. I review grants all over, and probably 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 have an AI/ML piece to it. So it's coming. So, well, with that, I want to give Jeff a moment here to end this, but we will end earlier. Esther, I think you can stick around for a few minutes afterwards. Sure. If anybody wants to chat with the speaker, which is easier to do when you're in person, but Esther will do it here. So happy to do that. But Jeff, you want to take the floor for a moment and thank our speaker?
Yes, please. Check. Phew, my Zoom completely froze, but the meeting didn't end. I'm so happy. I jumped onto a different computer and found you all here. I have no idea what the recording will show. Esther, thank you so much. This was a great talk. I want to ask you later about explainability and how explainable drugs are, right? And is that come up in the conversation ever? Anyway, another day. Esther, on behalf of the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Hopkins, I wanted to extend my thanks, our thanks, and a small token of thanks. If you can see here, this little token of thanks is it's referred to as the XE, and this is just something for your very fine shelf behind you there to remember us by, the BME-X series for translational research. Esther, this one's
thank you,
and it's on its way to you.
Thank you very much.
I would ask for resounding applause. Esther, thanks. Really excellent, interesting topic. Much appreciated.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, if you'll send me your mailing address, we'll put it in. It will be in the mail to you. And yes, I certainly second that. It's been great. So with that, we will formally end it. But thank all of you here. But Esther is here for discussion. So Andrew, if you have one, or others, just please take the survey. It's in the link. It's in the chat. Please take the survey before you leave. It's very helpful to us. So, Andrew, if you have something, unmute. And
yeah, just I'm wondering if you have any feel for when some of these ML-like regulations might be finalized. I feel like I've heard about this for several years at this point, and it's still all perspective and still in notice and comment. And
yes. I mean, I would say it's going to be 5 years, at least. There could be guidances that come out before then. There's a lot of work actually on like international standards. And so there could be some standards that come out that then become industry accepted practice that then FDA and other health authorities adopt. I could see that happening. but we're still like not even, most things are not even in the draft sort of proposed stage. It's all pre even that. So there's a lot to go, but I think that that's prudent because there's a lot to figure out.
Is internationally, I mean, there's probably not harmonization yet, but are any other countries further ahead in their guidances?
I wouldn't say further ahead, but there's certainly other authorities that are really trying to figure this out. So like Canada and the UK joined FDA on the good machine learning practice guiding principles document that was quite short, I would say. I mean, it's really 2 pages. It's like, I thought it was going to be longer. And then the EU has come out with a couple of white papers that have been quite conservative, actually. Right, so their solution to the bias problem is to just have perfect data. So no one solved it. No one, but countries are working things through.
Esther, I have a question about any companies that you're aware of that might be really good examples of companies that have done more innovative AI ML things and have them cleared, as opposed to some I feel like are super basic and maybe wasn't even that big a step above previous approvals. But any like particular companies that are shining examples of good or bad products in this space?
I don't know. I mean, so there is a lot of excitement, but it is pretty measured. Like, all right, like the most of the CAD software, it's to assist someone in generating a diagnosis. So it's all maybe in the mental health space, like therapeutics a while ago. I mean, they were one of the first to have an actual therapeutics software. And then they had a lot of trouble getting reimbursement for it. I think they've resolved that, but so I don't.
Is CMS involved, like related to this conversation at all at FDA, or the reimbursement that's totally separate to worry about for the companies to worry about?
Yeah, so when I was at FDA, there was this movement, particularly on the device side, to get some kind of like at least concurrent path where you could go to FDA and concurrently go to CMS, and they would overlap in some way so that it wouldn't be totally uncoordinated. I don't know how successful that has been. I mean, maybe it's been very successful. I just really don't know, but it is something that leadership is aware of, like in the government they're aware of. But at the same time, FDA is not allowed to consider pricing or reimbursement in their decision making. And the criteria for reimbursement on the CMS side is like just different than what it is for FDA clearance.
Well, there's many who've stuck around for this of still interest. Any questions from the?
I could answer Jeff's question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Emma.
I have another question if no one else will.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm curious if there are any examples of ML used in clinical trials. So not really as a device, for use as a product, but is like used by a drug company when they're trying to select patients for a trial or that kind of application.
Yes, and that's actually, so my company is doing that, and there are a handful of companies that are doing that. So with the idea being that today you're getting this chunk of patients to participate in a clinical trial, and maybe 60% of them will actually respond to your drug. Well, what if you could just not include that 40% in the first place? And if you could identify that 40% based on other characteristics that you have, because let's say you did analysis on real world data and now you understand that those are actually two different patient populations. And so that you can say, okay, actually my drug is for this subgroup of this people with this disease as opposed to this full larger group. And I think that's pretty exciting because it could make drug trials much shorter and shorter, smaller, less expensive. The right patients get the right drugs. The labels will be written in a way where the actual, like the people who are supposed to get the drug will actually be the ones who are indicated. So that could be really cool.
So that would eventually lead to something regulated like a companion diagnostic that is using an algorithm, but that seems like relatively straightforward compared to some of the other potential use cases that you threw out for ML.
Yeah, that's totally right. So it's possible that you could figure out that a biomarker that someone already has a diagnostic for is that's the linchpin. That's the thing that really will differentiate patients. And that's kind of easy. It's also possible that you would need an algorithm to be your companion diagnostic. And FDA has approved many companion diagnostics in the oncology space in particular, but no algorithms as companion diagnostics. So I can't wait to see who does that first.
Cool.
Well, Jeff, Esther's ready to answer the question that you got interrupted. If you want to ask that with us, we have to end at 5:10. But if anyone else wants to jump in before Jeff, or Jeff, go ahead and ask your question.
The bar is so high for AI. We're so intolerant of machine error, and and for good reason. Self-driving cars are not allowed to have as many accidents as human driving cars. Period. Explainability, right? To what extent have we held the bar for explainability in drug efficacy as we are for AI explainability?
Yeah, so FDA has definitely approved drugs where the mechanism of action was unknown because the clinical data supported the use of the drug. So when I was at the public meeting, FDA had a public meeting on the use of imaging and AI, and there were members of the public who were standing up on stage and were saying that AI had to be better than people, that AI had to be explainable and better. And none of the FDA people were saying that because it's not really an FDA way of viewing the world. Like because FDA is used to thinking about what's the unmet need, what's the alternative for patients, what are the risks and benefits, where does uncertainty lie? And there's always uncertainty in any decision that FDA is making. And so having a black box algorithm, having it be not explainable is a source of uncertainty. But I could imagine an instance where the clinical data was superb, where there was a high unmet need, where FDA would accept it. I think that they would just look at it on a case-by-case basis and say, given the patient need, given the risks and given the benefits, should we allow this to be on the market? And I would be shocked to see like a blanket prohibition against non-explainable AI. That doesn't feel like the kind of thing FDA would do.
Your guidelines mentioned a preference toward, which is great, thank you. Is the analogy to explaining drug mechanisms apt?
So I think so. Yeah, I think so. There's this weird piece about whether your algorithm is messed up because you used human data that was generated through like in a context where there's systemic bias. That I think is really hard. where if you're getting data from a healthcare system that just treats Black patients differently than white patients, and that's your source of truth, then the algorithm might say, hey, Black patients are more likely to have a severe version of this disease, but that just might be because that's when they walk in the door and not because they are actually more likely to have a severe version of this disease from the outset. So that's the one thing where I feel like AI is a bit different than not understanding a mechanism of action. But FDA still really likes to understand the mechanism of action. Like that's a really good thing. It's not like it's toss up.